Hi, this is again Tom Lucier, again with COVID-19, but now with a completely different aspect, namely the collateral damage. Because anything has direct and indirect consequences. And collateral damage in COVID-19 is a real medical topic. And here, first of all, let's look at the numbers, and you can see that indeed more than 500 million people had COVID. So this must have impacted on any healthcare system, and it did. Now, we can distinguish different consequences in terms of collateral damage of an epidemic, be it COVID-19 or the next one. First of all, primary, people may die of the disease, obviously, by itself, or of consequences of it. The secondary consequences are excessive waiting times, inappropriate treatment because of that, delayed treatment, and finally the tertiary consequences are at the population at large, the crisis, the financial crisis. NHS has less money, and therefore overall healthcare is declining in quality. So there can be huge collateral damages from a pandemic as we just experienced. And the first report came from Italy, obviously, because Italy was hit the hardest in the first wave. And here from Giro Indolfi, published in the European Heart Journal, you can see the decline in acute coronary syndromes overall. You can see STEMI and non-STEMI, a decline by 50%. It was mainly non-STEMIs, of course. And then, of course, we moved on to England. And in England, you can see we published this together with Colin Bagent. You see in the dashed lines when lockdown occurred, and you can see that actually the decline overall in the top left panel, but particularly in non-STEMI on the lower right panel, occurred before lockdown. So people are obviously scared because, you know, where do you get COVID? Where the patients are, and the patients are in the hospital. And that's what it caused. And then with Chris Gale, we looked at this, the place and causes of acute cardiovascular activity, mortality during the pandemic. Where do the people die? Usually they die in hospital, but during the pandemic you can see that indeed on the top, on the lower right panel, that indeed people did die in at home rather than in the hospital. So there was a reverse mortality from the hospital to the home, and therefore we looked in detail where this was most dominant. And you can see in stroke, more death at home in blue, acute coronary syndromes as well, acute heart failure as well, less so pulmonary embolism, and the other cardiac conditions did not change during the pandemic. But it's also heart failure, and here in the editorial by Teresa McDonough and collaborators, they looked at the impact of the COVID pandemic on heart failure care, and it's clear there's an access to primary care was reduced, GPs wouldn't answer or wouldn't see patients face to face, delayed diagnostics, reduced hospitalizations therefore as well, less treatment optimization, premature discharge because of fear, and missed and delayed follow-ups. And in the paper that this editorial was written to by Keshwani and co-workers on the heart failure quality of care and in-hospital outcomes during COVID-19 pandemic, they looked at this in more detail, and you can see they compared before in blue and after or during COVID-19 in red. And the major difference was people were less likely to get an ICD when they actually had an indication for it. And also blood pressure control was markedly less optimized during that period. But now we have a meta-analysis looking at this overall, not just single center papers that initially stimulated the interest in this topic. And here by Nadaraya and co-workers just coming out in the European Heart Journal, the collateral damage of COVID-19 to cardiovascular services, a meta-analysis. And of course, most of the papers, as you can see on this world map, in the dark colors came from the US, from Italy and England that were hit the hardest, and less so from France and Germany, and China, of course, as well, where everything started, and eventually also in Brazil, where of course measures were not very strict at all. And the collateral damage of COVID-19 is shown here. Hospitalizations on the top left, STEMI, non-STEMI, heart failure, unstable angina, and arrhythmias, all were less likely to be hospitalized, and these are acute, potentially lethal conditions. The hospital mortality is on the top right, and you can see particularly for STEMI, as you would expect, mortality is increased, less so for non-STEMI because there the delay is not so crucial. Heart failure mortality increased, and out of hospital cardiac arrest was not different. When we look at the lower panels, in-hospital management was much poorer, both for STEMI and non-STEMI. And interestingly, on the lower right, you can see there was more thrombolysis rather than PCI, which is known to be less effective for revascularization than stenting. Then let's go on to system delays. And you can see that the symptom to first medical contact hugely increased. People were scared to call the ambulances, scared to go to the hospital, waited too long. And of course, on the top right, you see cardiac surgery and TAVI. All these procedures massively reduced. TAVI a bit was not significant, but all the others, valve surgery, CABG, cardiac surgery in general, and aortic valve surgery massively reduced. Also, electrophysiology procedures against arrhythmias, pacemaker implantations on the lower left, then also cardiac implantable electronic devices, much less implanted, and of course diagnostic procedures on the lower right. Everything was markedly reduced, and that led to a huge waiting list that is still occurring as of today. So in summary, they showed that hospitalizations, both in the first and second wave, markedly reduced, procedures reduced, deaths, particularly for STEMI and heart failure, increased, and the widening of disparities in cardiovascular care. They showed that low and middle income countries compared to high income countries contributed only 20% of the studies, but they had a greater decline in STEMI hospitalizations and less primary PCI, markedly increased in hospital mortality. So that is really a major problem with COVID that has not been discussed to the extent it should be. And in the future, we need to be prepared to be better organized whenever a new pandemic or any other catastrophe hits the world to the benefit of our patients. So remember that, and I hope you enjoyed this Inside Cardiology. Thank you.